The next song that Hal Leonard has for us is Shenandoah. They've introduced the F sharp note in Danny Boy, although you've been doing it for a year or more, depending on where you started in this track. Now they're moving and showing us that the F sharp in the key signature puts us in the key of G. If you're just coming in out of the blue and running into this F sharp is found by playing a major scale in the key of G. It's placed in the key signature here to tell us that throughout the song, all Fs are going to be sharp. Not only this F shown on this line, but any F in any octave, anywhere on the guitar. Like we've seen in many other songs, this song is focusing on pentatonic notes, not exclusively, but very nearly. The pentatonic scale is not a rule, and it's not a prescription. What it is a tendency. It's a description of what people will do naturally when they sing. The physics of a waveform, the way we interpret it with our ears and the way we produce sounds with our voices, creates a draw toward the pentatonic notes. It's really very much a melody and a chord arpeggio at the same time. In this song, we see some of the same ideas that we've run into in other pentatonic songs. We're in G. Our primary note here is the G, the root. But from the pickup note, we're coming up from the fifth up to that root again, like we did in Amazing Grace and several other songs. You can see Amazing Grace, the three melody notes are really just a G arpeggio. The fifth, the first, and the third. As I've said before, melodies are basically like chords played one note at a time. Chords are almost melodies stacked up. The chord is not sacrosanct and it's not glued to the melody. In fact, people will reharmonize songs in many ways to create different interests, but the way the notes flow and the way they are interpreted by our ear really does indicate a chordal flow. This is a good representation of that given this melody, but you'll see songs where they'll substitute many different chords in, bringing in some minors and things like that just to add a little flavor, even a flat 7 in some versions. But those are alterations. Those are substitutions, and there is something about the melody itself that outlines chords, especially as you can see here. We've got the D and the G of a G chord. A passing tone, climbing up a scale. The A is a pentatonic note. It comes after the G and before the B, so it's a passing tone in the scale. The C is the non-pentatonic note. The pentatonic scale has lost the 4s and the 7s, but that doesn't mean they're never ever going to show up. This song isn't 100% pentatonic, so there we do see the C, the 4 note. Walking up the scale, you'd expect the C to get us to a D, and it does, but with a little bit of a delay. It leaps over it to the E and then drops back down to the D. That's called a double neighbor tone sometimes. It's also called an appoggiatura when you leap to a note and that settles and resolves back to a chord tone. And it's also a surround note. I like that idea. We want to get to the D and we surround it. We come from below it with the C, above it to the E, to finally resolve down on the D. We leap up to the G, another chord tone, fade to its F sharp, very dark sounding for some reason in this one, landing on this open E of the C chord, the 4 chord. D drops down to a D and back up to E. So that's a neighbor tone again. That's a neighbor tone below the chord tone. We hit that D again. We could consider that part of this G chord. It's an anticipation, or I've labeled it ET for not extraterrestrial, but escape tone. You'll get this idea sometimes, where you hit a non-chord tone and leap away to a chord tone in the next harmony. The B climbs up to a chord tone of G, dotted half note, 3 beats, tied to another half note, another 2 beats, another D, up to chord tones, the 3 on the C chord, E's. That anticipation again, or that escape tone, the E note steps down to a D, which is just presciently looking at the G chord next. We have 2 more chord tones, so we got an arpeggio on G. The D chord has its A, and then a G note. If we're still on the D, that's the 4. We're anticipating the G. It's also possibly a sus4 on the D chord, the D7. Anticipating into the G. We repeat our idea, come up from the fifth to the root. This next little chunk, an odd number of bars, seems tagged on. It's almost like the story just hasn't ended, and the person is nostalgically continuing to wax poetic here, expressing the longing. We're on a G, drops down to an F sharp. That's the leading tone in G. It's also a neighbor tone. G down to F sharp, back up to G. Chord tone, chord tone. You see how much we have to play Gs. G, B, and D are arpeggios of the G chord. That hangs into this E minor. It's a 7, which drops down to Gs, which are chord tones. Walking up, passing tone through a pentatonic A. Chord tone on G, chord tone on the D7, and the root. You can harmonize this many different ways, but this harmony does follow the natural flow of the voice and probably the emotional tendency of the song. Pentatonics come out of the waveform. They're what our ear anticipates. The chords too then are outlined by that melody as well. Another thing I find super interesting about this song is it's written as, it's a sea shanty possibly. It's a work song, possibly by French-Canadian voyageurs paddling canoes down a river. It's supposed to have that rolling feel of flowing water. Like other work songs, like the blues, in this harmony at least, we actually have a blues progression, but 100 or 50 years before the blues. We've got the one chord, the G. As your voice naturally does, it leads us to the 4 chord, which brings us back to the 1. That's our 8 bars. If we had a 12-bar blues, we'd now have a D7, a C, a G. This has a bit of a turnaround as well, but it's on the 4 chord. Resolved. Then again, we've got that kind of added material floating on the back of this. This one may feel a little awkward to you if you're an older student who actually has sung it or heard it by folk groups. Because it's an a cappella song and it's not strictly adhering to form, it has an unusual number of bars, and in fact, in most interpretations, it has actually varied meters where it switches from time signature 4/4 to 3/4 sometimes. I'm going to play it slowly as a ballad here so you can play along. And I will play in 4/4 with solid quarter notes, but the song actually has more of a sense of cut time with 8th notes. Let's try it out at a pace that you can probably play after, say, a week's worth of practice. We have a pickup note on beat 4, so I'll count to 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can play that melody along with that. The Hal Leonard book doesn't think you know these chords yet, but depending on what you've been doing with me since finding these lessons, you may have been playing a couple of years and you've been doing the chords for most of that time. So we've got G's, C's, D7, so 1, 4, 5 primary chords, and an E minor, relative minor, right here to darken things up. The way this song often works is this should be feeling more like 8th notes than quarter notes though. It could be written with 8ths, or we could change this to 2/2, or just say it's cut time, and then the pulse is moved. I'm going to try to play it like that, hopefully without dropping any of the beats that are a little bit more familiar depending on the versions you've heard. So I'd be counting this as an and 1 and 2, 1 and 2.